the climate crisis and the broader ecological crisis is to me a symptom of the deeper disease. And the deeper disease, which is that rift from nature, that seed of domination and of accumulation and of greed and of the urge to dominate others through colonialism, through slavery, through othering. The root is actually othering. That is something that artists can touch, and that's what has to be healed. And when we heal that, what could come of it? What does the world on the other side of that look like? And in simpler terms, it's what does the world on the other side of a just transition look like? And I'd really like to believe it doesn't look like exactly this, but with solar. The first language that colonization sought to suppress, which was that of indigenous peoples, is where a lot of the answers are held.
So welcome to another episode of the Conscient podcast. I'm in Vancouver with Anjali Appadurai, who will introduce herself in just a second, but I want to let listeners know that we're at Trout Lake Park in Vancouver, and Anjali is about to experience a sound walk. She hasn't done one before, but so sound walking is basically when you a way of being aware of your sonic environment when you're walking and experiencing different things. So just making note of all that. So Anjali, who are you? Welcome to the program. And can you talk a little bit about yourself, please?
Yes, hi. I'm Anjali Appadurai. I am a climate justice activist, an advocate, communicator. I guess I like to think of myself as a truth teller as well in this world of climate advocacy. And I think many of us who work in this field are, and it's it's tiring, but it is, I think, my life's work.
Nice. Well, the people can read more about you in your background in the link, but let's start with the big question about reality.
Yes, reality.
The program, but also your thoughts about a reality and working through ecological grief. How did you feel when you listened to that episode, and what kind of reactions did it bring to you?
Well, the episode was really meticulously done in terms of sort of unpacking this experience of reality, this moment as it is, on a global level and on a personal level for you. So I found it really resonant in many places for myself. I really resonate with this process that you're going through, working through the grief, but holding the hope in the same hand. And there was one line that stood out to me. You said, "There is hope, but it's hope wrapped in ugliness."
Oh, that's actually Todd Dufresne who said
okay,
that.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Well, that really resonated for me because that's what I'm moving through. That's where I'm at in my process right now. And it's constantly having to grow bigger to be able to hold that nuance and to be able to, hold the ugliness with the hope wrapped inside. That was resonant for me. But I also I like how you played, and you did this kind of through sound. I like how you played with the concept of time. And was that intentional through the soundscapes in the episode?
Well, one always plays with time when one composes, but
right.
I was trying to have a dialogue between the soundscape characters, because
right.
they're not really characters, but they sort of are, in relation to the content, with silence being also an important player, so that there's moments of absence of sound, and then
right.
a sound emerges, and then it kind of complements or contrasts with the words. So it's not a new thing at all, but it's the way I chose to articulate it.
Right.
And then I went from reality, some kind of definition of reality with a strong sort of Zen lens, and then just working my way through and letting all those wonderful thinkers in quotes sort of bring the listener into their own idea of what reality might be. And whether they've been through, everybody's gone through some kind of grieving, but whether they've actually done ecological grieving is another thing. So, yeah, that kind of thing.
Writer Britt Ray. When a small change in a complex system produces an enormous shift, that new pathway gets reinforced by positive feedback loops, which lock in all that change. That's why tipping points are irreversible. You can't go back to where you were before. A tipping point that flips non-linearly could be the thing that does us in. But it could also be the thing that allows us to heal our broken systems and better sustain ourselves.
Well, for me, that was a big piece because it, you really reflected the deep uncertainty that's inherent to eco-grief, which has to do with time. You talked about tipping points, and we don't know which one will set off which new reality. And then you had this, clanging of the clock, and then that clanging of the clock got distorted, and it sped up and it slowed down. And so to me, that was really like, okay, we have actually no idea. So we're just swimming in the uncertainty, and we have to hold all these feelings within this sort of temporal uncertainty, which I guess is any kind of grief is that, but with climate, it's extra because you simply don't know which tipping point we're heading towards.
Public policy professor Eric Beinhocker. Humankind is in a race between two tipping points. The first is when the Earth's ecosystems and the life they contain tip into irreversible collapse due to climate change. The second is when the fight for climate action tips from being just one of many political concerns to becoming a mass social movement.
I'm just going to stop you there and have a little sound walking moment here. There's lots of bird song because it's April 2nd today. It's actually Good Friday.
Yes, yeah.
Beautiful bird song and a little bit of traffic hum, but not too much, so it's very
Kids
pleasant.
laughing.
Yeah, very lively and joyful. That's good.
Yeah. People are happy as they can be. People are tired, but, enjoying the beginnings of spring.
Yeah. Yeah.
Other things that stood out to me?
Sure.
Another... I feel like I'm always bringing this into conversations about climate, but it is, my reality as I understand it from this, from studying this crisis from so many angles. And, I think you're very right when you talk about the departure from unity with nature, the duality, the separation of mind and body, man and nature, and how from that springs this deep imbalance that I think manifests itself in climate change and in the patterns of greed and excess that drive climate change. And I think that's true for sure. I think it, springs, back to the Enlightenment days. And that's a deep wound to heal. I also really have trouble using the word we when it comes to climate change. And I have real trouble resonating with the sort of extinction of the human species frame because, and I think we talked about this in an earlier conversation, but for me it's all happening on a spectrum, like where there is no drop-off point at which our species goes extinct, but rather that extinction started a long time ago. And it started with the suppression of indigenous ways of knowing. It started with colonization and, the selective exploitation of certain parts of the world and the disappearance of different ways of understanding the cosmos and the balance of man and nature and how society can live within nature. And what I'm really getting to is that the climate crisis to me isn't something that, it's not a tragedy of the commons. And I think that's often framed as if it is. Like, we're all too greedy and self-involved to take care of our common planet and therefore we'll all suffer for it. It's actually, to me, a very directed, intentional thing. And I don't think humanity can be placed on one plane when it comes to climate change. And that's where the equity piece comes in, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, the crisis was consciously created by the development of a certain economic system by a certain group of people, and the spread of that system through means of direct exploitation, through means of slavery, through means of colonization, through means of domination. And as certain people dominated other people, they also dominated nature, or thought that they could dominate nature. And so to me, the climate, I like to think about it in terms of climate violence, actually, rather than just climate change, which implies a sort of like passive thing that's happening. But climate change to me is being intentionally driven.
Law professor Shalanda Baker. Will we redesign systems to replicate the current structures of power and control? Or will we reimagine our systems to benefit those who are so often left out of discussions regarding systems design?
It's way less poetic to think about it that way, but that has its own galvanizing quality when we don't think of ourselves as regular people, or as people who care, as being, as being sort of like grouped in with those that are driving the crisis. And I think we are, and I think there's really clear distinctions here. We live in the global north. That's a totally different reality. It's a totally different experience of climate change. We live in a very late stage capitalist nation. That's also a very different climate reality. Everything we do here in this so-called country is directly connected to the rest of the world in an intricate web of power, of ecology, of humanity, of trade and exchange of goods and resources. And everything is so much more interconnected than the climate conversation sometimes allows it to be. And so I find it very difficult to have, a national conversation about climate change without taking into consideration how deeply our national activity is linked to the rest of the world, and how, what's our positionality within the world. Even within Canada, we have, we all know how Canada was built and whose lands it was built on and how it was built on those lands, and that's a microcosm of the rest of the world. And so in that sense, I really see it as this fractal web. A spider web is fractal. And it's a similar thing. So, who's the we is what I struggle with, essentially.
No, I hear you. And when COVID hit, there was a sense that we could rebuild better and all those cliche terms. But there's good intentions behind them, because there's an awareness that if we just rebuild what we had before, we're going to have the same problems. And there isn't any one solution to a set of issues as large as the ones that we're now.
Absolutely.
And now we see the scope of it. I think we see it better, because the notion of a just transition and those are sinking in. I'm hearing people talk about it, say, of course, we have to address all kinds of inequities to address the real issue behind the climate crisis, which is an ecological crisis, which might be a civilization crisis. I'm not, I don't know for sure, but I'm certainly learning. And it has a lot to do with listening, and there's a bike coming by here, and it's going to be really pretty. Those bicycles are a lot of fun.
I never thought about how pretty that sound is.
I love bikes, but that's another subject. But thank you for raising all of that, because those issues, I think, is what we need to normalize as our conversation, that vocabulary and those various, they're not new perspectives, but I think there's a sense of receptiveness broadly now to are you feeling that, or is it still a struggle to get people to talk about these things?
I feel it's both. Depends on the room that you're in. I think maybe if you're steeped in the conversation, you start hearing that receptiveness more because you're just exposed to more perspectives. But I think at large, it's not really part of the conversation here.
Not yet. Well, then let's talk about how the arts can play a role, because I know that you're interested, you're a musician and involved in culture as well as environmental activism and other things. How do you see the role of arts and culture? I mean, so far there has been an active role, but I know you think there could be a larger role. So what are your thoughts about that? Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think you were right in the reality podcast when you said, the reality episode, when you said that it's stories that, it was a quote from someone, I forget who it was.
Yeah, well, there was a couple. One was Richard Wagamese, who's an indigenous writer who talks a lot, and a great storyteller.
Yes, exactly.
Writer Richard Wagamese. To use the act of breathing to shape air into sounds that take on the context of language, that lifts and transports those that hear it, takes them beyond what they think and know and feel, and empowers them to think and feel and know even more. We're storytellers, really. That's what we do.
This intellectual exposition isn't really going to move a lot of people. And of course you can illuminate truths and you can frame things differently, but it's really stories and sort of the way artists can take something like this tree and just look at it from a different way and cast it in a different light and imagine it in a different context. And I think art just has the power to help us collectively imagine collective futures, different possibilities existing at the same time. Possibilities that exist outside of our day-to-day logic patterns, our patterns of thinking. Art is a different language that can help us become more comfortable with the unknown, even lean into the unknown, create together. And I think that the arts have a critical role to play in this.
Artist David Haley. We now need aesthetics to sensitize us to other ways of life. And we need artists to sensitize us to the shape of things to come.
It's not exactly the role that many people think, which is that, people will create some environmental art about the beauty of, and this is all important, by the way, I'm not knocking it, but it's not just art that highlights the beauty of what we want to preserve, which is the majority of the climate art that I see, we want to preserve this, protect our coast, protect these trees, protect the bear and the whale. And all of that is absolutely necessary. But also we want art that can help us imagine a different way of being. Because ultimately, what we want, yes, we want to build back better, and better doesn't mean keeping everything the way it is, but with renewable energy. Yeah. Reduced emissions, zero emissions, but the same power dynamics. That's actually not... Climate, to me, is... The climate crisis and the broader ecological crisis is, to me, a symptom of the deeper disease. And the deeper disease, which is that rift from nature, that seed of domination and of accumulation and of greed, and of the urge to dominate others through colonialism, through slavery, through othering. The root is actually othering. That is something that artists can touch, and that's what has to be healed. And when we heal that, what could come of it? What does the world on the other side of that look like? And in simpler terms, it's what does the world on the other side of a just transition look like? And I'd really like to believe it doesn't look like exactly this, but with solar. The first language that colonization sought to suppress, which was that of indigenous peoples, is where a lot of the answers are held.
Activist Sheila Watt-Cloutier. It's important to recognize how closely linked environment, health, economics, culture, and rights are in our society. The earth is a living, breathing entity, just the same as our bodies are. Our survival utterly depends on living in nature, not apart from it.
Well, that makes sense to me because I've experienced it. I've seen artworks that have moved audiences and me in ways that I never would have expected and probably couldn't have experienced in any other way because it's not necessarily rational. It's not necessarily something that we can expect or anticipate. But then the question is a question of amplitude and impact, right? Because artists have always been concerned about social issues, and that's not new. And it's always been the case. And there have been moments of transformation through the arts in history. Not necessarily transformation, but certainly impact. So, you and I and others are talking now about how to better coordinate and move forward various actions by the arts, and they want to do these things, but it's a question of at the national level, international level, how to make this happen in a way that's genuine for the artist, right? That where they can authentically be who they are, they don't have to play another role. But that their impact can be amplified and heard and in a way made given some centrality. When I worked at the council, we used the term, having a seat at the table.
Yes.
A lot of people are excluded from the tables of the world.
Yes.
How do you bring inclusivity and take the art for what it is? It's a powerful language that does. I don't need to convince you, but I'm actually not even trying to convince people through this podcast that art is great, because either you do or you don't.
Or you don't.
But either you can learn more. But anyway, your thoughts on how things can, what are some of the gaps or some of the areas where you think we could do more to get the arts community involved in and around not just climate change, because it's not a problem, it's like you say, an issue, part of a much larger set of issues.
Yeah. Well, something that's important to me that I'm working on in my role at Sierra Club BC as well as the Climate Emergency Unit is really believing that there can be a better relationship between artists who are who they are and should not be asked to be anything else or do any type of niche different art, and sort of I guess, what would you call the sector? I guess like the change-making, social change sector?
Social innovation.
Social innovation, social change.
Yeah.
And I think there's a relationship there that is really lacking. I think so far it's been a sort of extractive relationship. Artists aren't valued the way they should be. They aren't paid the way they should be, or resourced to just be who they are and do their art. And I think there's tremendous power in a better relationship there. I think when you have a relationship of reciprocity, so for example, for myself at Sierra Club BC, we're an environmental nonprofit organization. Oh, dogs are so cute.
Yes, and they are sonic as well. Let's just stop for a second here. There's a lot of them running around, you know.
I remember there was one who was originally from
But we won't eavesdrop on this
is
three persons conversation.
Yeah, with a recorder in it.
Sierra Club BC.
Yeah, so just using us as an example, you know, how can an environmental nonprofit organization have a more reciprocal relationship with artists that actually enables artists to provide really the leadership that we need from them? And to me, that's a question of capacity building. I think artists could... You're right, there's artists already really addressing the moment that we're in, and that's tremendously important. But it's also, as you said in the episode...
Artist Lance Garavi. While individual works of art, however genius, may have value, they won't do the trick. What we need is for all art to be about climate change.
We need all art to be climate art. We need it not to be a niche. It's not just a one issue that you only go and consume that art if you already know, or, you know, if you already care about climate change. We need it to be something that's being reflected by the artists of our time in all mediums. And to me, that's a question of capacity building, because the as you explored in the reality episode, it's not always possible to see reality or to experience it. It's a very curated reality depending on what you're exposed to and the truths that you've been able to learn and the perspectives that you've been able to listen to. And how would that influence the art? How would that influence the artists if there was good, proper capacity building resources, good storytelling that artists can have access to, that can help them understand better the moment that we're in, and in a way that doesn't just plunge everyone into grief, but in a way that reflects the reality in all its terrible complexity with its rays of hope.
Well, that's, you know, and one of the people I recorded here in Vancouver is a guy named David Maggs, who's written a piece about some of these issues, and there's a growing momentum, I would say, of academics and activists, but then how at the national level is that mobilized? Now, maybe that's a funder responsibility, or maybe that's an institutional responsibility, but I think it's also a question of empowerment and solidarity, right? A sense that we all are here faced with a challenge that is unthinkably complex, and the younger generations, like I mentioned to you, my daughter and my son, who are deeply concerned about their futures, and many young people are anxious about it. What do people who have some control and some power do that is impactful in the sense of addressing the issue as we face it now, you know, because one of the things I struggled with in the program was how do you what do you tackle? You know, do you do a long-term approach? Do you a short-term approach? And it depends on your skill set and your interests and your passion and all that. But for artists, they tend to work long-term, right? They tend to propose a vision of the world, and so we will need some long-term thinking as well as the short-term change. All of that combined, so that it's like a mosaic. You know, you get all these different pieces that come together.
Well, I think it's important to give artists a sense of the direction, the North Star. Where are we moving to? What is the outcome of the climate crisis. And maybe that's something I should have led with, because that's the big question for me in our collective discourse. What is solving the climate crisis? What does that even mean? There's ways we could do it now. That would be, shutting down all emissions, and then what would be left with? Who would lose first from that equation? And then there's this question of justice. What's a just way to decarbonize? And that's the conversation at a global level, right? At an international level, for a lot of smaller developing countries that have been, maybe they've experienced hundreds of years of colonialism, so their economies are very weak or very dependent, and so they need time to stabilize themselves and to give their people quality of life. And so what does it mean? Who has to reduce emissions first? Upon who is the onus to lead the way? So all of these questions point to justice. And what does it look like within Canada? If we have people who are already extremely made vulnerable by this system, what does climate justice look like for them? And so I think this is where you need the activists who have that deep sense of justice in their hearts that they're working towards, and you need them hand in hand with the artists, is what I feel.
Well, let's do that.
Okay.
Because in a way, it's already happened in bits and pieces, and so we'll come back to that. I wanted to end with. I come back. Maybe in another episode because this is an ongoing conversation. I wanted to end just a bit with this notion of privilege, because that's been a real eye-opener for me. I've always been somewhat aware of privilege, but it really, in a strange way, I was recording the reality program and I started listening to my voice, and I thought, it sounds like a privileged voice. That's me. It sounded a little pretentious and a little, I called it ecological mansplaining, it's like, a little bit, but enough to kind of wake me up to that whole, and so I started reading and thinking and talking to people, and so I think that's something that those who have privilege, in different ways, because there's many tips, really have to be aware and change the way that they do things and the way that they spend money and all everything. And it's not that hard to do. The awareness kind of takes you into action. But I don't know, any thoughts on the notion of privilege and how that's an issue?
This really meshes with what I was talking about, sort of to circle back to the beginning of the conversation. We were talking about who's the we, and privilege is the central question to that. Looking at the issue as this multi-layered thing, and looking at it as a spectrum of history, where what have the power dynamics been in, say, you can take a slice of history, you can say the last 500 years. What were the advantages? Privilege can go back as far as you want it to go back, right? And of course it's so nuanced, it's not every white guy has this much privilege, but you do have a privilege that goes back hundreds of years. And I think one aspect of privilege a lot of people leave out is this economic aspect, right, of class and resources. And that to me is, it's not often talked about in the climate conversation, but it's a huge piece of it, because when we talk about the extinction of our species, this extinction doesn't happen overnight. It happens in a spectrum. Who are the last ones standing? It's those with the most resources. Who are the first ones to go? It's those with the least, the most disenfranchised. So I don't think you can talk about climate without talking about privilege, ultimately. And I think it's on each of us to unpack that for ourselves, and to bring that into the conversation, because I see a lot of climate discourse that is very, it's happening on this level. It's really, this is my beef with the individual responsibility piece. And we talked a little bit about this, how it's very important to be a conscious consumer and to reduce your individual footprint and to be aware of yourself and be responsible in that way. But to me, that's
kind
more
of a baseline.
It's a baseline, and it's, to me, that's less of a question of impact and more of a question of solidarity, and understanding where we're at in this moment. And on the other hand, to me, that can quickly devolve into a question of privilege as well, right? If we make the solutions about behavioral change, isn't that a question of ability and resources and privilege at the end of the day as well? Yeah. And I'll just leave with one more thought. There's a lot of framings about how to divide up in an equitable way the remaining emissions, the sort of carbon budget of the world. So carbon budget is a framing in and of itself. And then there's this other framing that floats around the right to atmospheric space, and how if you look at atmospheric space as a human right, and if you divide up how much we have left in the world, how many people have way more than what would be their fair share? How many people have way less? And that's a deep question of privilege as well. And talking about the global north, I mean, that really plays into our global privilege.
Well, we can work with all of that. Some of it, like you say, artists might not be as well informed as they could, and we will do what we can to point them to good quality information, like and circles of conversation.
Absolutely.
Without saying that anybody's right or wrong, but there is knowledge out there.
Yeah.
That we can work from in history and stories, people's experiences, right? What they've actually experienced is valuable. So we're going to wrap this up. We've walked all around the Trout Lake, literally.
Yeah.
We've had some nice sound experiences that we didn't, like all the crows, they came in different density. And anyway, I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I certainly did, and the sound
likewise.
But I always ask the guests at the end, is there anything else that we missed that you would like to say?
I feel like we've been all over the place in this conversation, and I don't think so. I think maybe just leaving with a reiteration of something that we both have in common, which is just really hoping that the arts can take on more leadership role in this next era, in this next phase, in these critical next 5 to 10 years. And I'm going to be doing everything in my power to make it so. And I really hope that we're able to change sort of the role of the arts going forward, making it less of artists being used to send a message, but rather placing artists in the lead to help us see the world differently. Yeah. There's 2 kids in that tree.
Well, maybe we'll go to the sound of the tree. We'll end with this. Just one of my favorite sounds is the sound of children playing, and just it's like pure joy,
Absolutely, yeah.
And there's a bit of tennis over there.
So much pent-up joy. These poor children have been inside all winter.
It's been a hard time.